sometimes reminded of something Avi Ravitsky, former colleague of Moshe Halbertal from the Hebrew University, liked to say about a matzah baker in Jerusalem who told that he lost about 2%, or he's losing about 2% of his clients every year. And when he was asked, so who are the 2%? He would say 1% are Jews who are so secular that they don't eat matzah anymore at all on Passover. And the other 1% are Jews who are so orthodox that they only buy the shmura matzah, the very orthodox kosher matzah, so they wouldn't buy from him anymore either. And I think in a way that picture, not precisely, not for people who love statistics, but in, I think, a symbolic way, reflects some of the changes of Israeli society. So there are some recent research, important works which are undertaken, which tell us that there is the secularism of Israeli society is a progressing phenomenon. There are clearly others who show that the Haredi element is also progressing, and I think this is not necessarily a contradiction. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight our keynote speaker. Moshe Halbertal is a professor both at the Hebrew University and at NYU's law school. And that's why he comes right now from the Yale Law School to us, where he's teaching this semester. He has also taught at many other places. He has published on a range of questions which all deal in some way with the ideas of Jewish law, of Jewishness in many different manifestations. His latest book is a study on Maimonides, but he also always refers to contemporary discourses in Israel. He is clearly a public intellectual in Israel, but also here. And those of you who read the New York Times this Sunday could have read some of his quotes in an article by Tom Friedman. Actually, when he was asked about the status quo, I thought that was quite interesting, the answer he gave about the situation in Israel right now. It is the definition of tragedy, he says. You have all these really good arguments for maintaining a status quo that will destroy you. And I think that is a very strong sentence, something which maybe will be relevant for his talk tonight as well. I'm very much looking forward to his lecture, which will focus on Israel at the crossroads of democracy, nationalism, and religion. Please welcome Moshe Halbertal.
Well, good evening. Thanks for the warm welcome, and it's an honor to lecture on this issue before you. The issue that we want to address, relevant to the conference as a whole, what is a Jewish state? And in particular, what is a Jewish state given different pressures, internal pressures, that has to be taken into account while defining the Jewishness and the nature of the state. And I think given all the threats and issues that Israel is dealing with, Iran and the Palestinians and other issues, Hamas, ISIS, at the end, the ultimate concern, I think, for Israel is to work out a coherent self-definition of its identity. And I will attempt in this lecture actually to articulate such an identity. It's a manifesto, it's not an analysis, it's my own conviction. I'll try to convince you as well. But I'm taking a stance on what I believe is the most important challenge of Israel, which is to define itself. And define itself here given the following essential pressure, which is the combination of a Jewish democratic state. While Jewishness can mean either of two things. One is Jewish in the sense of religious, Jewishly religious, and then it might threaten democratic commitments vis-a-vis issues of religious pluralism and freedom, etc. But we hear many times different trends in Israel saying, well, this is a Jewish state. That means that we have to a certain degree, enforce or coerce religious practices in the name of the Jewishness of the state. So we have to figure out what is exactly the Jewishness of the state in terms of its religious content, if at all. And if it has, how and to what degree it coheres with democratic values that we cherish. That's one issue. Then there is another inflection to the adjective Jewish, which is ethnic, national. Right? This is our state. This is our national home. And that actually might threaten other democratic values that has to do with the equality of all citizens in a state. We have a large non-Jewish minority in Israel. And in the name of the nation state, in the name of the Jewishness of the state, in certain ideological segment of Israel, there are callings to discriminate our minorities, because after all, it's a Jewish state. So the idea of a Jewish democratic state is a complex idea. It's pressured from two very different directions, either the Jewishness of the state in terms of religion, or the Jewishness of the state in terms of nation. So it's a huge issue to work out in a serious way. And there is a third pressure of all those who now come and say, well, this whole idea of a Jewish democratic state doesn't work. We have to divest Israel from its nature, from its essence, or from its definition as a nation state. So we are at a moment where our very idea, our very identity of Israel is at stake. And I have, my aim is rather modest in this lecture. It's to try to define a robust sense of the Jewishness of the state that will cohere with our democratic values and that will appeal to large enough majority in Israel so it can define the identity of the states. That's the aim of the lecture. That's all. That's it. Now, being a citizen of our country is a full-time job, because you tend to run the country in your head all the time. And when you meet someone else that does it, and there are few people who do it as well, you even form a government. But that's what I want to use this opportunity to try to articulate. I just want to say, before I get to the definition of what I think constitutes the Jewishness of the state, what are the elements that constitute the Jewishness of the state, I want to say a few other issues besides the large conceptual challenge. It has to do with transformations that occur in Israel, let's say, from the 70s onwards. We have to remember that the identity of Israel was established through different coalition agreements and legislative acts during the 50s. But since the 50s, Israel has moved and transformed itself rather dramatically. And I want to mention 5 transformations, 5 changes that also bring more pressure, or I would say bring more urgency to our task of defining our core identity as a state. And it was mentioned, Michael mentioned already a few aspects of that. I want to mention 5. And I want to begin with the first transformation, which is the transformation of the relationship of the ultra-Orthodox community to the state. I would say since the end of the 70s onwards. The traditional view of the ultra-Orthodox, let's say in the 50s and the 60s, was we rejected the very idea of the state. Rabbi Shach used to say, Galut Israel beyad Israel, we live in exile under Israel, right? We want to protect our way of life, given the pressures of a strong secular nation state. And that's our task. Right? There is a story, there is a famous story. I come from an ultra-Orthodox family in Jerusalem on my mother's side, and an uncle of mine told me that once an ultra-Orthodox person was burning the flag in the Day of Independence. There is such a practice in the margins of the ultra-Orthodox community. And the Briskerov, was a great man in Jerusalem, said to him, "I see that you are becoming a Zionist." He said, "But I'm burning the flag." He said, "Well, will you dare to do it in Russia?" He said, "No." He said, "Here you feel at home." So the issue was, I mean, the ultra-Orthodox, I mean, this has to be more nuanced, but on the whole, the ultra-Orthodox mode of relating to the state was, it's not ours, we're not part of it. We have to protect our way of life given the pressures that are inherent in that project. And that was the traditional mode. That's changed. It's changed, and the ultra-Orthodox community is rather in greater and greater growth, but not only growth, integration into the state. By the way, you just can measure it politically in an interesting way. The way traditionally ultra-Orthodox parties used to be in Israel is we don't join the government. Joining the government is too much of an identity with the state. We support the government from outside in the Knesset, but we don't join the government. Slowly they moved more and more to join into the government. By the way, in the previous government, there was a deputy minister of health from Agudat Israel, Litzman. He was the deputy, he couldn't be the minister, that's a little bit too much. But there wasn't a minister of health. Now, you have to be a great Talmudic scholar to understand the refined distance that it still exhibits from the state, right? You are a deputy minister with no minister. In any event, there is a greater and greater integration of the ultra-Orthodox, which is actually, to some degree, a blessing as well. Greater and greater integration of the ultra-Orthodox into the state, which means that the pressures on the identity of the state, on its content, are growing from that community that saw itself for many years apart. I would say, here again, I'm sorry, I'm generalizing. And all these things need refinements, but I would say the following. If you look at the ultra-Orthodox community, once its enemy was the sovereign, it was Ben-Gurion. Today it's the Supreme Court, not the sovereign. It's Aaron Barak. It changed its enemy. And it's interested more and more to have impact on the nature of the state. Right? By the way, previously Agudat Israel was never interested in a halachic state because it was never interested in a state, needless to say, halachic state. But as the sovereign is embraced, there is growing and growing pressure by this community on the nature of the state. Now we could have devoted a whole analysis why it happened. I would say just two things. One of it is economy, right? The ultra-Orthodox economy traditionally used to be a father-in-law economy, or in Yiddish you would say a mechuten economy, right? There was, if I take my own family, there was not all the not all the boys went to study. Some of them went to work as well, and they supported the son-in-law who went to study among other children that they have. My mother had 9 brothers and sisters. Only one of them became a head of the yeshiva. The other went to the workforce. For a variety of reasons, with the universalization of yeshiva learning to all Haredi male, now I see at the generation of my cousins, there are no more father-in-laws. And there is a process of the mechutanization of the state, right? The state has become the father-in-law. it supports that community economically, and when you are supported by the state to such degree, you become integrated into the state. But it's not only economy, it's very hard to live in a Jewish nation state as if you are in exile. It's a problematic project, unsustainable even among the ultra-Orthodox in Israel. So the first transformation, I said I'm going to mention 5, is the integration, growing integration of the ultra-Orthodox community into the state. The second one, which is not independent of the first one, is the growth of a secular community, which is more interested than its previous generation in issues of religious freedom, liberalism, or you might say freedom from religion. I'm not sure freedom of religion. But there is a strong secular, robust, liberal, some say anti-clerical community. By the way, if you look at the voting patterns, when I was a kid, there was a party that stood for that, against religious legislation, against the religious establishment, was Shulamit Aloni. She barely got 2 seats in the Knesset. Today, with such a platform, you get 19, 20 seats in the Knesset. There's a growing community that secular. The previous generation was not particularly liberal. It was interested in state building. This community has a kind of a robust sense of desire, a deep desire for religious freedom or a strong secular identity. You might say, here again, roughly speaking, the Tel Aviv state. So we have, I live in Jerusalem. I have many friends whom the kids are moving to live from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. They feel better in Tel Aviv. And a friend of mine went to visit his son in Tel Aviv. He said, you have a wonderful place here, it's beautiful. And his son says, yeah, we believe in two-state solution. So it's, you might say it's a state with a newspaper, not a flag, but a newspaper, Haaretz. It has even a newspaper. Now, this is all, again, generalization, but it's clear if we want to look at the second transformation is a growth of a robust, secular community. You see it electorally very powerfully in, I would say, from the mid-80s onwards. There's 20 seats in the Knesset, more or less, of that. And as they say, they are in some ways responding to the emergence and entry of the ultra-Orthodox into the institutions of the state. They dialectically depend upon one another. The third transformation, I said, we'll talk about 5 of them, is the Russian Aliyah. You have a big immigration to Israel from the former Soviet Union countries. It's something around 20% of Israelis. They come with a completely different idea of what the relationship between religion and state ought to be. They're secularized. The whole structure of marriage and marriage laws in Israel doesn't suit their family structures. Some of them are mixed marriages. Some of them, they're strongly secular on the whole and nationalistic on the other side. This is a new element that is very powerful. It's there. Electorally, it's also a force. The fourth transformation is, I would say, weakening to a certain degree those trends in Israeli society that were the bridge between religion and modernity. It was the Sephardi community, the Mizrahi community that was far more moderate than the Ashkenazi community. The religious Zionist community, the central forces are, for a variety of reasons, eroding. For a variety of reasons, Shas, the party of the religious party of the Mizrahim, trying to move them closer to the ultra-Orthodox from their traditionalist way of life. So there is this fourth element that is changing as well. Then the fifth one, which I think in some ways very crucial to the future of Israel, is the transformation of the Israeli Arab community. And when you look, again, this is generalization, but I think it captures something. When you look at the Israeli Arab community and its political elite mainly, it used to understand its whole goal as fighting against discrimination, a minority trying to fight against discrimination within a nation state. That's usually was the political Israeli Arab elite. Today, it's more and more challenging the very identity of Israel as a nation state. I would say this is not a discriminated minority, this is a minority under occupation. And all this is happening, by the way, in the last 20, 30 years. And you have to bring it into the mix when you ask yourself, well, where is our country going? Or you would say, if you look at those 5 transformations, say, well, they're more or less the 5 tribes of Israel. You have the ultra-Orthodox, the Ashkenazi secular, you have the Russian ex-Soviet Union Aliyah, you have the Mizrahi community, you have the Israeli Arabs. More or less, by the way, here I'm kind of throwing a guess. Demographically, numerically, they're almost the same size, each of them. But that would need more refinement. And you ask yourself, are we a Jewish democratic state? You would see the 2 tribes out of these 5. The ultra-Orthodox wants a Jewish state to a certain degree, but it's not clear that it wants a democratic state. The Arab community wants a democratic state. It's not clear that they want a Jewish state. And then you have the other 3 tribes who never actually figure out what exactly they want in terms of their identity as a Jewish state. But it's become more and more crucial for the state to define itself given these transformations. So this is just a general beginning of the background of where we are and why this is such an important challenge. Now, I want to say one thing that pertains to a philosophical position about states, about nation states, that is a preamble to my proposal for Israel's identity as a Jewish state. There is a point of view that you hear it quite a lot in critical discussion on Israel, that for a state to be truly liberal and democratic, it has to be neutral. It shouldn't have a cultural identity as a state. Right? This is nourished by a certain conception of liberalism, Rawlsian liberalism, that states ought to be neutral in order to be fully democratic and liberal. They shouldn't take side culturally, given the diversity of their communities. Now, I don't believe in neutrality of states. I don't think, by the way, it's a necessary or sufficient condition for democracy. There are many nation states that are not neutral state in the strong sense, right? If Catalonia will become a state, it wouldn't be a neutral state. It will have Catalan as its language. Its official calendar will be connected to Catalan history. Its public education will enrich and transmit particular traditions of the Catalan nation. It will protect its identity through immigration laws and maintain a majority of Catalans. And yet it's still a democratic state if it treats its non-Catalan minorities in a decent way. So I'm just saying this, we can talk a lot about that. I assume, for the sake of argument, that the demand on neutrality of states is too strong unnecessary to define their democratic commitments. Right? We know, for example, how important, and this is a non-neutral decision, the language that is taught, the official language that is taught in a state, how it tears apart states, right? In Belgium today, in Quebec, in Canada, the language issue, right? It could be so difficult that in Congo they still continue to talk the language of the colonial forces, you know, because if they will pick one language, they will tear themselves apart, given the differences, the linguistic differences inside. Deciding language already is not a neutral state. I remember asking once Rawls, I was a student of Rawls, when I studied philosophy, I asked him, in this original position of Rawls, in what language will be the debates being conducted? At the moment you decide a language, you're not more neutral. Language is a thickly cultural idea. In any event, we can go on and on about that. I assume that state neutrality, cultural neutrality is not a necessary condition for democracy. When Norway seceded from Sweden in 1904, they seceded because they perceived themselves as an ethnic, cultural, distinct entity, and by that they didn't become a fascist or a racist state. There are many, many nation states in the world. Israel should not be picked as this kind of oddity, anti-liberal oddity, because it is a nation state. Okay. So how would I go on to define, and here's my main argument. What do we mean by the Jewishness of the state? And I want to say there are four components that I see essential to the self-definition of Israel as a Jewish state. The first, and I think the most important of it, is that Israel as a state, given that it is a Jewish state, has a political responsibility to the well-being of Jews as a whole, not only to Israelis. Israel is, in that respect, an expression of the Jewish right to self-determination, and by that we mean the following thing, that the Israeli government, the Israeli sovereign, has a responsibility to the Jews, to the Jewish world as a whole. If, God forbid, someone is attacked or harmed qua a Jew anywhere, Israel has a responsibility of solidarity with the Jewish people as a whole. By the way, if it's not going to have that, it will become a state only for its Israeli citizens. But if it is a Jewish state, it means that it's deeply bonded with the Jewish faith as a whole. Now, that can take different forms. By the way, they can take the following form. If our deputy foreign minister, and I'm referring to something that happened, embarrasses the Turkish ambassador, he has to remember that there are Jews in Istanbul. And he, as an Israeli official, qua an Israeli official, has responsibility towards them as well. This is, for me, the essence, and you might say the essence of Zionism. The essence of Zionism is that Jews have taken the means of sovereign state to determine their political fate. That's the most basic aspect of the Jewishness of the state. Do Jews deserve it? Behlet. Absolutely. If there is a right to self-determination, a national right to self-determination, our people deserve it, like many other nations. By the way, now we talk about the Iraqi state. There are 30 million Kurds. You know that there are 30 million Kurds in the world. They also deserve the right of self-determination. They're also crushed. They also have a problematic history. And Jews deserve right of self-determination. If I ask myself, what is the first and foremost important aspect of Israel as a Jewish state? It is its responsibility to the political well-being of Jews as a whole. That's the first thing. By the way, Jews can say we don't want it, and that's fine. I can see diaspora Jews saying we don't want that. But from the point of view of Israel, they are custodians. We Israelis are custodians of that great right of self-determination of the Jewish people. That's the first one. The second element, which is deeply connected to the first one, is the law of return. The law of return means that every Jew has a potential right of citizenship in Israel if he or she wishes it, because it is a homeland. Now, some people would say this is a discriminatory rule. But it is a discriminatory rule if this is the only way of being naturalized into Israel. It shouldn't be the only way of naturalization in Israel. There are other ways of becoming citizens in Israel. For Arabs who marry a spouse or a husband who come in, birth, other ways of naturalization. If this was the only way of naturalization, it became a discriminatory rule. By the way, if there will be a Palestinian state, and I'm for it, and if it will be willing to live side by side with Israel, it should, and rightfully should, have a law of return of its own, given the diaspora of Palestinian, etc. in the world. And we are not going to claim this is discrimination. Now, I'm not going now to define who is a Jew for the sake of the law of return. I have an answer for that. Please ask it in the question and answer. And it's an interesting issue. It's a complex issue. But that issue arises because, as I think, an essential feature of Israel as a Jewish state is the law of return. The third element. The third element is the public symbols of the state that are drawn from Jewish culture and Jewish past, the flag. We have a Magen David, by the way. Usually it's in the World Cup that I see how many other states have a cross in their flag. I counted, I think. I think there are something like 27 European states that have a cross in their flag. We don't feel they're racist because of that. Am I exaggerating? I don't think so, but maybe I am. But there are plenty. This is not a violation of the democratic nature of Switzerland or England. Hebrew is the official language. The calendar is a Hebrew calendar. By the way, again, states have calendar. The United States, it's the most neutral country that there is, in a serious way, because it's not a nation state, still has a bias in its calendar towards a particular Christian community. Right? Every time I teach here in the fall, comes Sukkot, go explain to the students that you're not showing up because it's Sukkot. Or for a Muslim, whether it's Eid al-Fitr or other things, right? In Israel, the calendar is Jewish. So there is language, there are the public symbols of the state. All these are features of the Jewishness of the state. Again, they don't violate in any way democratic, liberal commitments. Soon I'm going to get to the minority rights in Israel, but this such feature of the state doesn't violate the democratic nature. That's the third aspect. The fourth, which is for me the most important aspect of the Jewishness of the state, is that its public education, state education, is committed vis-a-vis the Jews of Israel, in Israel, to the flourishing and continuity of Jewish cultures, and I say it in plural. By that I mean, if you have a kid in Israel and you want him to get a decent Jewish education, whatever Jewish education you have in mind, secular, religious, etc., he can get it for free. Right. because it is a Jewish state. I'm saying cultures because Jews do not agree on what is the Jewish identity. But from the point of view of the state, its public education will reproduce, will be a vehicle of continuity of our cultures. It will teach Jewish history, it will teach Jewish literature, it will teach Bible and Talmud and all the great resources of our culture in variety of forms. By the way, this is again not a violation of the democratic nature, liberal nature of the state. In any nation state, that's public education. If you are in France, you study Voltaire and Descartes, etc. You think that Descartes invented all of philosophy. And you study that particular French great tradition. You become acculturated into an identity through the public education of the state. So if you ask me, and here I give you a definition, when you say this is a Jewish state, what do you mean? For me, it means those four elements. The responsibility of the state to the Jewish people as a whole, one. Second, the law of return. Third, public symbols of the state, language, calendar, etc. Fourth, the commitment of public education, centralized education vis-a-vis Jews, for the continuation and the flourishing of Jewish cultures. Now, I don't think, by the way, that those features, as they are, stand in any particular contradiction and tension with democratic values. And I want to pursue this line of thinking. By the way, for me, these are the features that define the Jewishness of the state, and these are the only features that define the Jewishness of the state. After these four, we say Dayenu. Right? That's where I'm aiming. After these four, and I would say the following. If Israel will safeguard those elements, and the main thing, it has a responsibility for assuming actively the political well-being of the Jews as a whole. If it will do that well, if it will create a place that any Jew can come in and wouldn't have to be in my father's faith, knocking at the doors of other states to find a place and couldn't find. But there is a place for the Jews. And if it will have a public sphere that is embedded with Jewish symbols, etc., and a strong, rich, deep Jewish educations, it will do a lot. And I, from the point of view of the state, don't want any more from the state in that regard. And I want to say a few things about it. What do I mean by this Dayenu? You don't want the state to use its coercive machinery to adjudicate the differences between the Jews and their own understanding of what Jewishness is. The last thing we want of the state is to engage in that debate. This is why I'm against all forms of religious legislation. All different forms of the project of religious legislation means the entry of the state into deep issues that Jews are divided about how to live their life as Jews. And we know that they disagree. Rumors have come to Jerusalem that Shabbat in Tel Aviv looks quite different. That's fine. You don't want the state to enter that question. That means, by the way, full commitment to religious pluralism, it means breaking the rabbinic monopoly over marriage and divorce. And now I'm saying it, and I'm saying it as someone who's committed to the life of mitzvot. You don't want the state to favor a particular trend in Jewish life. I'm not for separation of religion and state per se. I don't think that's the model we should adopt. And that's fine. The state can, by the way, subsidize religious mikvaot and synagogues, etc., etc. But nobody should have monopoly over that subsidy. And it has to be given per capita. And the state shouldn't engage in defining who's a legitimate rabbi. You know, the 120 Knesset members, they're very pious, I know. But still, they don't have the right, or they shouldn't have the privilege or the right to define who's a rabbi, what is a legitimate Jewish denomination in Jewish life. If they are engaged in such a thing, they do three harms. First, they harm our commitment to genuine religious pluralism. It's an absurd that in the home of the Jews will have less religious freedom than they have in Kiev. That's one thing. The second thing is, I think, at the end, they harm our desire for the flourishing of Jewishness in the country. I see among my students a very interesting thing. Many of them get married, but outside the rabbinate. They go to Cyprus to marry. Israel, by the way, has to recognize those. If there will be a Palestinian state, they'll go to Nablus. Right? Because they don't want to meet the rabbinate, not so much in the marriage, but in the divorce. Especially if you're a woman. And you have greater and greater alienation from religion, from anything Jewish, that comes out of the fear of a possible coercive religious machinery that will define their life. So this is the intervention of the state in matters of religion is not only harming religious pluralism, it's harming the quality of religious life in Israel. But there is a third issue. Israel is first and foremost a state, a home for all Jews. We are committed to that. That's the meaning of the law of return. At the moment it will define the Jewishness of the state robustly through legislation, it won't be the state of all the Jews. It will alienate many Jews from Israel. By the way, if Israel says, we recognize only Orthodox rabbis as legitimate rabbis, at that moment it alienates many other Jews who have other rabbis. And they ask themselves, is this our home? By the most absurd thing, here's a gesture towards the issue of who's a Jew, but I'm just gesturing, is that in that law, that is the deepest expression of Israel as a home for all Jews, at the moment you say that you are going to accept conversions only done by Orthodox rabbis, at that moment, in that law itself, you alienate so many Jews from feeling at home in Israel. And you cannot do that if you're committed to be a state of all Jews. Now, Shabbat, I mean, we can talk a lot about Shabbat in the country, you know. I am communitarian in the sense that I think that we should have regional sensibilities, that there shouldn't be, transportation shouldn't pass through religious neighborhoods. I don't think a person has the absolute right to get home in the shortest possible road. I mean, this is not the genuine right. I mean, if this was an absolute right, there shouldn't be traffic lights in the street. You can compromise sensitive to communities. By the way, part of the problem of achieving compromises is when the framework is not set. Every local problem becomes the last place. If we lose that, if they close the road, I don't know, in Jerusalem, soon they close it in Tel Aviv because there's no limits. So you cannot work locally in a reasonable fashion. Then Shabbat, in Shabbat, all government offices should be closed. I'm against clearly opening commerce. This is unfair for Jews who do not want to observe Shabbat. It's also unfair against small businesses who are now pushed to open business because the big malls, etc., are open. We have a lot of work to do in Shabbat, but it's not about the interference of the state, the coercive interference of the state in the religious or irreligious identity of their citizens. I want to talk about our Arab minority. The ultimate test of a nation state is not that it's neutral. No states are really neutral. The ultimate test is the way they treat the minority. By that I mean that their national identity doesn't penetrate to the level of the economic, political rights of their minorities. So if Kosovo becomes an independent state, that means that the Serbians who once were the majority in Kosovo when it was part of Serbia become minority and there is an Albanian majority. The test for the Albanian majority will be how they treat the Serbian minority now, the new Serbian minority. Our ultimate test as a nation is the way we treat our Arab minority. And here we have some improvement to do. I'm not talking now about the West Bank. I'm talking about Israeli Arab citizens in Israel. They're given political rights, they're given economic rights, but de facto in terms of distribution of public funding vis-à-vis infrastructure, vis-à-vis education, vis-à-vis, they're 20% of our citizens. But in the public sector, in the governmental sector, I think only 5% employees are of the Israeli Arabs. Investment in infrastructure has been improved, but it's only per capita 2/3 of what a Jewish citizen will get. There has to be, we have to equalize that. De facto, not only the UN. There's only another feature. If we look out of the 4 aspects that define the Jewishness of the state, 2 of them has to be given to our Arab minority as a cultural minority. And by that I mean the following. Israel has to, and it doesn't have to, it's also in practice, has to recognize Arabic as an official language, has to recognize the Islamic calendar as a state calendar. And the 4th element, in Arab schools, public education in Arab schools will give the Arabs what the Jews have, which is the means of the flourishing and continuity of Arab cultures through public education in Israel. The Arabs are not only individual equal society, they are a cultural minority in Israel and they should have the rights of a cultural minority. They're not having the first and second aspects of the Jewish state. If we want a full equality in that respect, hopefully there will be a Palestinian state that will be responsible for the Palestinian people as a whole and will have a law of return into that state. Now, I want to say, and I want to finish so we can have some questions and answers. I know that there are many challenges to this picture. What did I do? I did something out of a sense of urgency, because many times I talk to leading politicians in Israel. I ask them, what do you mean by a Jewish state? And not only leading politicians, I meet a fellow citizen. What do you mean by a Jewish state? And what I try to do is to say what I mean by a Jewish state. And I think those four elements that I mentioned are genuine elements that define the Jewishness of the state. They live in harmony with our democratic commitments. And we hope that in long term, they will provide a framework of our deepest dreams of Israel, of a flourishing of Jewish cultures. By the way, there is in Israel such a thing. On many levels of creativity, in music, in art, in movie, in learning, in scholarship, in forms of life, diversity of forms of life, that we live one next to the other without, or let's say, overcoming the great temptation of each of them to use this coercive machinery of the state to enforce on them or the other, without that. And they will be protected. The state will do its job in terms of the well-being of their security and economic well-being. And will give equal rights to their minority, to our minority, to our citizens, to our Arab citizens, both as individuals and as a cultural minority. Now, I want to say, I mean, we have to refine many things, and there's a lot of refinements to do in terms of marriage and divorce, how you break the monopoly, what shapes does it take, civil marriage, other forms, maybe not civil. There's a lot to discuss in RFI. I gave you a blueprint. I think, here maybe I'm over-optimistic. I think there is a majority for that in Israel. I would say there are groups in Israel who are not going to accept it. But I think it's generous enough that they can live with it. But it's crucial, and that's, I think, part of the agenda of the conference to a certain degree. It's crucial for what I would say the three tribes to define what is it that they want to be as a Jewish state, because I think, like all human projects, usually the big failures of human projects have to do with inherent tensions within the project and the way they cannot handle those tensions. That's always the subtle problems in every great human project. It's not so much the threats from the outside. And given the pressures that come from this precious idea of what it is to be a Jewish state, given the turmoil and the shifts in the different demographies of Israel, it's important to engage in this exercise of self-definition. It's vital. It's existential. And that's what I try to do. Now I've laid out my basic beliefs, and I invite you to challenge it, clarify it. So thank you for your listening, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you very much, Moshe. I think there will be a lot of... Actually, we could have listened another hour, but we will have some questions, and I'm sure we will listen a little bit more to you. Please.
Thank you for the honor of the first question. You said that one of the definitions of a Jewish state is responsibility to the Jewish people as a whole. I ask you then, what is the responsibility of the Jewish people as a whole to Israel?
That's very good. We expect, as Israelis, a solidarity. And by solidarity means standing with Israel. That doesn't mean agreeing with the actual present government, but standing in an engaged commitment to that precious endeavor, precious historical endeavor of the Jewish people called the State of Israel. It takes different forms. It takes a form of political support. By the way, when you talk to American Jewish community, Israel needs American Jewish community geopolitically and strategically. And the growing of indifference of American Jews towards Israel because we don't provide every week a 6-day war, and we cannot. It's very messy. It's called Intifada in Gaza, etc., etc. We don't. Not every day there is an Entebbe exercise. We need the support. And it has to be a two-way sense of solidarity. And it means, by the way, that those who are critical have to voice. Now, sociologists talk about these two options of voice and exit. We don't want exit, we want voice. Right? Albert Hirschman has this beautiful book, Voice and Exit. We want voice. And we want world jury, in this case American jury, to be part of that debate and conversation. And it takes many forms, cultural, political, economical, being there in the full sense of the word. I'm not talking about aliyah. It's fine, I mean, that's also a welcome thing. But that's not the issue. Solidarity. Solidarity of our people as a whole and support. And the biggest enemy of that is indifference. A growing indifference and alienation. And in that respect, I say, Israel needs that in a most simple way. And you're right, this is a good question. It should be a mutual solidarity. And I just want to say one thing which I think it's important on a different level. 20th century Jewish identity was an epic identity. By that I mean what happened to our people in the 20th century, you couldn't ignore the Holocaust, the state of Israel. We might enter a post-epic century. Baruch Hashem, thank God. And that, by the way, and Jewish identity in a post-epic world will be preserved by Jewish learning and knowledge and education. Now, here's an interesting project. Could we work out a shared curriculum of Jewish learning that will be enriched by both sides of the spectrum? And other things. But yes, there is an expectation of mutual standing together in solidarity. Because that's what Israel is about as a Jewish state. And that's an important comment. We can imagine many forms that that thing can take. Many creative forms that that thing.
Michael Meyer.
My question is, how sharply are you willing to separate the political from the cultural realm? Would you go so far as to say, as some liberals in Israel and outside have said, that Israel should be a state of all its citizens, and on the other hand, a state in which everything is done to allow the majority culture, the Jewish culture, to flourish in a pluralistic fashion? Or do you say that the cultural and the political cannot be completely divided?
When I said that I am committed to a Jewish state, at that moment I say Israel is not only a state of all its citizens. But it is. I don't think that Israel ought to be divested from its nation-state features as a state. I think, by the way, a state of all of its citizens that will include, by the way, usually when they say it, it includes the West Bank, maybe it includes Gaza. That means Jews will be maybe a minority in that state. I don't think it will be a state of all its citizens. It will be just a very bad exile for Jews. That's at least, you don't want to be a Christian in that state. I don't think you want to be a Jew in such a state. I think you better be, by now, in another exile in the world. So I think if there is a just solution, is two states solution, where each state that is a nation state, because we have two strong national movements, is committed to its national identity and treats fairly and decently its minorities. So I think that's where we should go. By the way, all around us, in Syria, in Iraq, to a certain degree in Lebanon, what you see is the downfall of the multi-ethnic states. The breakdown of multi-ethnic states. You don't want to make Israel into a multi-ethnic state. Because what goes on in Iraq today will be a picnic in comparison to what we're going. There, at least all of them talk Arabic. And they more or less belong to the same religion. I said more or less. Still. So, as I said, what I try to do is the following. Say, Israel can be a Jewish state. It's not a state of all its citizens. It is a nation state. At that moment, it's not immediately defined as fascist, that racist, etc., etc. It depends exactly what do you mean by a Jewish state. So if you tell me that a Jewish state means that per capita every Jew has to get double of the money spent for education than a non-Jew, that's a fascist state. It's not a nation state. Etc., etc. So our task is to say we're going to maintain our nation state, but in ways that will be embracing both to religious diversity within us, religious pluralism, and to our non-Jewish minorities. By the way, I just want to say, it's not an oddity. It's not like Israel will be the only country that invented it. Every European state, more or less, is a nation state. Right? Even Czechia is a nation state. The Czech Republic separated itself from the Slovaks. They're actually, surprisingly, they agreed mutually. How does that happen? It's very complicated. Right? Here are two nation states with minorities, by the way. There are non-Czech minorities in Czechoslovakia, in Czechia. And it's fine. It's not, doesn't make the Czech Republic an illegitimate state. It has Czech as its language, etc., etc. And that's what we want Israel to be. Now, there are pressures inbuilt to that self-identity. And the main task is to contain those pressures into a coherent, workable scheme.
Max Friedman.
Yes, I'd like to thank you for your admirable clarity in advancing the proposal that Israel could be a normal nation state like others. And I'd like to ask for a little more in explaining on this question of Israel, of the state of Israel's responsibility to Jews who are citizens and residents of other countries.
Right.
What is the principle that makes that distinct from, for example, Russia's responsibility towards Russians who are
Russian
citizens
minorities in Ukraine.
in Ukraine and Estonia and
Yeah.
the like? Can you explain why extraterritoriality is not what you're calling for?
I'll tell you the following thing. We know in European history the responsibility for extraterritorial minorities was a reason for huge abuses. So the Germans invade Czechoslovakia because of the German minority in Czechoslovakia. You can, by the way, Israel can invade the whole world because there is a Jewish. Okay, no, but we mean something else, right? Jews might be vulnerable. Look, let's talk for a minute at the law of return. Massively, the law of return was enacted twice. In the 50s, with the flood of immigrants that came from Arab countries. That's the first time. The second time, massively, it was enacted with Jews exiting the Soviet Union. Now, they were vulnerable. These Jewish communities, for a variety of complex reasons, they were vulnerable. And they didn't have a place to go. It's not like the United States were opening its gate to a flood of Jewish immigration. I tried to get a green card in this country. It's very complicated. So, okay, so I mean the following thing. I mean a genuine responsibility. I mean, it's not that you wish the Jews everywhere to be in a complicated position. In Europe, if you take, there might be a third wave of massive enactment of the law of return, which we don't want to, from Europe, for a variety of complex political reasons that have to do with the growth of Islamic minorities in different countries. A variety of complex reasons. Israel is there, is responsible for that. By the way, it is responsible to pressure, if it has leverage, to pressure the French government to be aware that Jews in France are in vulnerable position. It doesn't mean it's going to invade, it's going to use its pretense to invade France in the way the Russians are using the Russian minority in Ukraine, etc., etc. That's what I mean. And it is, what I would say, Israel is a project of solidarity. First and foremost, it's a project of solidarity with the Jewish faith as a whole. That's what I mean. Again, we wish that aspect of the state should not be enacted all the time. It should be there as an idea, ready for it.
Nathan Sachs?
Thank you. I have two parts to the question. I'll wrap them into one. The first is if you could talk a bit about the political reality of the 5 tribes you described and how you think it can be solved. I can see the Tel Aviv tribe more or less accepting it, assuming maybe on Shabbat you'd have to give some things, but that's if they accept it. But you have 4 other tribes that it might be quite hard to sell to. And in particular, given the second aspect of my question, which is assuming a bold prediction that we're not going to see a 2-state solution this year, and we're not going to see a declaration of a 1-state in the near future either, in this limbo in which we live, the model breaks down a bit. You describe a clean model, a clear model with two nation states, but if we don't have that, where do we stand?
Okay, I would say the following. Let's take the Israeli Arabs. A lot of the radicalization of the Israeli Arabs, it's not the only reason, has to do with we have responsibility for that as well. And I think to a certain degree we failed that test. And I think I would say more than half of the Arab in Israel, I would say even much more. They will feel comfortable with that idea of a nation state that will grant them full equality as individuals and will give them cultural minority rights. The problem is when they hear Jewish state, they hear marginalization of them. And there, by the way, some Jews who help them, right? Some of them belong to one of the tribes. Right? you know, the Liebermans of the world that like to draw support from, you know, flaming, you know, this thing, rivalry, ethnic rivalry. So I would say the following. You asked me, I think, the Israeli Arab minority. At the moment, by the way, there was only one government in Israel that was really committed to equality of Arabs. It was Rabin's government in his second term. Now, at the elections afterwards, there was a massive vote of Israeli Arabs to an Israeli general, not to Yossi Beilin, to Ehud Barak for prime minister, because they thought, you know, that would be a continuation. There is a dialectic, etc., etc. Now, you asked me whether the Haredim can live with it. They can live with it if, and this is again, you work out on a more communitarian-based forms in which their form of life can be flourished and protected. So I would say, you're right, I would say there will be resistance, but I think, again, this is not a platform for a constitution, right? These are principles, basic principles that have to be detailed and worked through, etc., etc. There are people here who engage with it in a more detailed, nuanced fashion. But I think that's acceptable as well. I would say that there is a stable majority for that. Jews in Israel want a nation state, and they want it to be democratic. And they can organize themselves around such a platform, while I would say the radical groups can live with it. That's my sense of it. I just want to say, by the way, it's very important for me to make the following statement. These elements define the Jewishness of the state. They don't define Jewish identity. By the way, Jewish identity is far more robust than these four aspects. It takes many deep forms, communal forms. It takes many forms of life. It's Talmud Torah and different ways of observing mitzvot, or other, or non-observing mitzvot, different forms. The only thing I'm saying is that the state is not the one who fully defines Jewish identity. It's a framework where Jewish identity can flourish in different directions.
Okay, we have, I think, the gentleman in the blue. Yes.
Yes.
Introduce yourself.
I'm sorry?
Just introduce yourself.
Oh, yes, my name is Adam Sherry. Do you believe that there is a disconnect between Americans' views of Israel politically? In other words, do you believe that most Americans fail to recognize that Israel is an ideologically diverse society? Do you feel that that Americans tend to view Israel as politically monolithic?
American Jews, you mean?
Or Americans in general?
I mean, it's so diverse. Among the Jews I meet here, the spectrum of political convictions is as like in Israel. I can come up to a certain synagogue in the United States and they would think that I'm a traitor vis-a-vis Israel because of my opinions. And then I have to ask them how many more wars I have to fight till you consider me an Israeli patriot. So that you have the right, you have the left. It's in that respect, it's as split as Israel, and there is a failure, especially among liberals here, to recognize that they have partners in Israel. It's not like, well, in Israel they're all one thing and here they're different. And they have to partner together. They have to work together. But I think American knowledge of Israel is so diverse that I don't think I can give an intelligent answer to this question.
I think we'll take one last question.
There's some students there.
Okay. Two. You see one
Yeah.
student? Or I don't know if you're a student, but maybe not. A young man.
And Moran.
I just wanted to refer to a question that was asked previously. So it seems like this model exists quite neatly in a vacuum, but if, like some politicians have suggested, like Bennett, sort of expanding Israeli sovereignty if the one-state or the two-state solution doesn't come to fruition, or if the one-state solution doesn't necessarily come to fruition, how is this model going to coexist with the new reality on the ground?
Okay, so you want me to go into Israeli politics? Ahlan wa sahlan, why not? Okay, so let's be clear. Israel cannot be a Jewish democratic state if it will continue to control the West Bank. It's simple. Now, it will seal its fate if it continues to settle in the West Bank, because then it will make this situation irreversible. It also will engage itself in a political project that nobody in the world understands what's the rationale behind it. And unfortunately, our present government has made settlements the cornerstone of its foreign politics. And any person with any sensible mind asks itself, what the hell are they doing? In what way it serves Israel? Not only that it doesn't serve Israel, it actually fosters a condition in which our dream of what it is that we want of Israel would not be possible to imply. Now, does that mean that tomorrow you get a two-state solution? No. That does mean that you have a partner on the other side that's easy to deal with? No. But you have to look a little bit further, and you have to understand that the de facto annexation that is done slowly undermines our very identity. You wanted an answer? That's my answer. This is, by the way, why I don't vote Bennett, for example. I know, again, I just want to say one thing, it's very important. Israel has interests, and it has genuine security interests that it has to take care of. And Israelis are rightfully concerned that if they give up the West Bank, they're going to be shot mortars from Tulkarem into Netanya. They have a bad experience, and they have good reasons to worry about that. So work on security arrangements. Don't settle. That's not our interest. That's my opinion. I didn't want to talk about it, but since you asked, why not? You're right.
So I have something on these lines too. I would like to ask your comment on that. My name is Moran. Right? I heard Nathan asking a question, so I also want to ask a question. Potentially a sixth wave of transformation, which is a toxic combination between Jewish identity with the emphasis on Jewish ethnicity, nationalism, and religion. Mm-hmm. And I think it's something that is being reflected in Israel, unfortunately, not only through demonstration, but really, even in political polls. I can remember when was the Jewish home of Mafdal, for that regard, so high. And I would like your comment on the sixth wave.
Look, I don't denounce my fellow citizens that quickly. I think on the whole, Israeli society is very democratic and tolerant. I don't want to ask what will happen in the United States to an ethnic minority that will celebrate the defeat of the United States in a war against its nation. There was a Japanese minority here in the Second World War. Israelis are tolerant. The fact that they don't kill one another about the issues of religious tension the fact that Israelis, though they have they feel very bitter that they're fighting while others are not. And they're also supporting them economically. While those who get support think of them as half Jews or whatever. And they're not riots in Bnei Brak. And Bnei Brak is not attacked by Netanya or Tel Aviv. It means this is basically a tolerant society. And I think, by the way, on the whole, Israel is a remarkably tolerant society. It has also immense high temperature politics, stakes are very high, and it manages transfer of power in a non-violent fashion again and again. There is a strength to it. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not evil, winds and bad things going on. But I don't have a harsh judgment on my fellow citizens in that respect. I don't see bleak things. This is a racist society. No, I know. I'm not. No, I look at the society. I say it's something. There is achievements. There's work to be done, etc., etc. But it has a degree of toleration and inclusiveness that, given its fragile political condition, it's rather remarkable. I would even dare say miraculous. Maybe that's a good note to end such a meeting.